What's up, everybody? Joe Chavarria here again with another episode of the Joe Credit Show. Today, we're going to talk about a final debt collector rule that's been added to the proposed debt collector rules, and we'll talk about how it's going to impact, the average consumer or you if you have a debt collection account, and when these changes are supposed to come. So all that and more on the latest episode of the Joe Credit Show. So before I begin, let me give everybody sort of like a backstory as to what I'm talking about. What are these proposed debt collector rules? What are debt collector rules? Who is the CFPB? What's going on? So on and so forth. So let's give everybody a little backstory. Lots been happening in 2020 and 2019 with all of this, predominantly in 2020. So a lot of proposed changes put together by the CFPB. So the CFPB, which stands for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, they put together a proposed list or proposed rules that debt collectors are going to need to follow. Now, what's interesting about this is that this does not change or amend the FDCPA, which the FDCPA stands for the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. And that's actually the law that regulates the debt collector space. And it debt collectors, predominantly third-party debt collectors. So the FDCPA does not apply to original creditors or banks like Chase, Wells Fargo. Those are known as original creditors or original account holders, right? And so the FDCPA does not apply to those guys. It applies to third-party debt collection companies like Midwest Recovery, maybe AFNI, those kind of guys, right? Those are known as third-party debt collectors. So third-party debt collector is someone who will be assigned a debt to collect on behalf of the original creditor. So for example, say you stop paying your Capital One credit card when you're like 18 years old, you're 25 now, and all of a sudden you get a call from a company called Midland Funding, right? Midland Funding basically probably was either assigned that debt or they bought that debt from Capital One, and now they're collecting on it, on behalf of Capital One or for Capital One or for themselves if they own it, to be able to recover the amount that's past due. So that's a third-party debt collector, someone who is not the original creditor. That's what the FDCPA, that's who the FDCPA applies to. So what the CFPB has been doing is that they've been issuing some additional rules. These are known as the proposed rules put together by the CFPB to basically kind of tack on to other things that debt collectors are supposed to do along with the FDCPA. So these are some additional things that collectors will need to start doing later on this year. We'll talk about the proposed start date and when these are supposed to go into effect. And the CFPB, so even though this is not really in the law, why does this really matter? Well, the CFPB is sort of like a watchdog for the financial space. They look at all financial related industries. And so, they're someone you don't really want to mess with. And so even though this is not a law that's put together by the FDCPA, even though the CFPB is putting together these rules, breaking these rules, breaking the CFPB's proposed rules here could lead to them, pursuing legal action or really bothering you, if for whatever reason, if you're a debt collector watching this video, which I'm sure you're probably not. These are more for consumers. So part of these new rules, so there's a new rule that is going to be added to the original proposed rules. So some of those proposed rules, just to kind of bring everybody up to speed, one being a debt collector can only contact the consumer up to 7 times within a 7-day period, right? Can't contact more than 7 times within 7 days. Anything outside of that, anything in addition to that would break these proposed rules. Debt collectors are being able to text and email, but of course they have to have certain language and specific wording in there they have to follow, but they will be allowed to text and email consumer. I think many of them were kind of already doing that, but the CFPB is just making it more known that this is allowable, but it needs to be done in a certain way. And of course, debt collectors will begin to be able to contact a debtor via social media. So Facebook, Instagram, whatever social media platform you may be on, if you find yourself owing a debt and a debt collector trying to reach you can't connect with you by phone, by text or email, they may result to going to social media, maybe direct messaging you on social media is another way to try to collect the debt. The CPB has said that's going to be allowable. That's going to be okay under these proposed rules. So there's some things that would favor the debt collection agency industry, but a lot of things would also would not, like prohibiting them from doing a lot of things. And so with this new rule that they are introducing to be on top of all of this, it revolves around the validation notice. So the validation notice is a notice that is typically sent out to a consumer. If you ever were to request information from the debt collector, let's say you wanted to know a little bit more about the debt before you decided to pay it, you wanted to know what the amount was, what it was for, who's the debt collector, so on and so forth, the validation notice would serve that purpose. So the new rule that is being implemented here by the CFPB for the debt collectors is that a validation notice must be provided to the consumer upon the initial communication or within 5 days of the initial communication. Before, the validation notice was sent out whenever the consumer would ask for it. So they would contact you if you owed a debt. They would contact you, try to collect the debt, but they wouldn't send you a validation notice or respond to your validation request unless you asked for it. They would send out a dunning letter. So a dunning letter is a little bit different than a validation notice. A dunning letter is similar to a validation notice in the sense that they will, before they contact you or before they report your credit, before they do any of that, they will send out a dunning letter, which basically says like, hey, this is communication from a debt collector. We're collecting on behalf of, XYZ company. This is how much you owe. It's been in our office. Here's how you contact our office. Here's if you have any questions, your right to dispute it, so on and so forth. And if you don't respond, or if we don't hear from you within 30 days, we will automatically assume that the debt is valid. And so that's known as a dunning letter. It's like the initial letter that's sent out by a debt collector before they contact you, before they report, before they do all of that. And so now what the CFPB is proposing is that the debt collector is going to be required to send out a validation notice, a little bit more detailed than the dunning letter, a little bit more information prior to or at the initial communication or within 5 days of the initial communication. So they're just putting a little bit more on the plate of the debt collector. I think it's good. I think transparency is key. It's going to allow the consumer to have the ability to push back a little bit, question it. I don't really see a big increase in consumers paying their debts they owe at this particular notice. I think this is going to create a little bit more work for the debt collector. But again, I kind of like it because it does create a little bit more transparency as to what is going on with that debt. So in the validation notice, there are going to be some requirements in the validation notice. So something to keep an eye out. If you get a validation letter, look for these things, because if it's missing some of these things, then it would be a validation violation or violation of insufficient validation notice, and that would violate this rule, which could allow you to have the upper hand in trying to negotiate a settlement with this debt collector, or maybe even pushing for a CFPB complaint, which could lead to a removal, so on and so forth. So pay close attention to this validation notice that now is required for them to send out at the initial communication or within 5 days. So the validation notice must have the statement that indicates that this communication is from a debt collector. That usually is already there. It's also known as the mini Miranda. Basically says this communication is from a debt collector. Any information is used to collect this debt, blah, 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 right? That's the mini Miranda. It needs to have the account number. So the account number needs to be on the validation notice. If it's a financial product or service, the letter must have the debt collector's name, the debt collector's mailing address, the debt collector's contact info. It also needs to have the mailing address of the consumer who owes the debt, the name of the creditor to whom the debt is currently owed to, and the name of the creditor as the itemization date. And so the itemization date is where it gets a little tricky as well. So the itemization needs to be on the letter, and it has to include the current amount of the debt, reflecting interest, fees, payments, and credits that have been applied since the itemization date. And so the debt collector may select one of the 5 reference dates as the itemization date. So the itemization date can be one of 5 different things. It could be the last statement date. It could be the charge-off date. It could be the last payment date. It could be the transaction date. It could be the judgment date. So that it needs to be on there in terms of the date that this itemization began. So when did it start? When are these charges being itemized? When did that begin? It must be one of those 5 dates. And last but not least, the consumer response information. So on this letter, it also has to indicate how would the consumer, what kind of recourse does the consumer have? You know, your right to dispute. How do you pay? If it's a judgment, what do you do there? So on and so forth, right? It needs to have some level of action that you can take as a consumer, as a debtor. If you have a debt collector, it has to include the way that you can respond, to the way you can take action on that letter. So all that needs to be on there. So those 5 components need to be on the new validation notices. Again, the validation notice must be sent out to you upon the initial communication or within 5 days of the initial communication. I would believe if a debt collector is calling you, they're going to either probably try to email you this letter right then and there, fax it to you if you have a fax machine, or do something to the effect of getting this notice in front of you right then and there. Or if they make contact with you, you know, they may probably just go ahead and mail it out to you. So you'll probably get it within 5 days. So more than likely, that's probably how it's going to go. Unless it's the Dunning letter, then of course they're going to just send out that Dunning letter anyway. And now that I think about it, what debt collectors probably will do is they'll probably try to merge the two. So I got to look into that, see if that's going to be allowable. But I would think that the debt collector industry will say, okay, so we have, typically debt collectors will have responses. They'll have their Dunning letter template, and then they'll have their validation letter template. So if I'm a debt collector in the space and the CFPB is saying I need to send my debt collector letter, my debt validation letter within the initial communication or within 5 days of the initial communication, I may say, you know what would be easier? Let's just make our Dunning letter the validation letter. And that's typically sent out automatically anyway before we even make contact. And then that way, our butts are covered basically under this new rule, and then we can just proceed as business as usual. So basically, I think what could happen here is the Dunning letter, which didn't contain a lot of this information, probably will begin to contain this information now. A little bit more information that will be included on that first initial letter. I think that's a strong probability of what will happen. And then you as a consumer watching this, being a little bit more educated, a little bit more sophisticated on this new rule that's being proposed by the CFPB, you need to look out for these categories, these areas where they're supposed to follow, and see if you find any discrepancies. Again, the account name, the mailing address, the debt collector's address, the original creditor's address, the itemization. I think that's where they're going to get tripped up a little bit. The itemization needs to be on there, which has an itemized list of the charges, and it needs to be backdated to a certain one of those dates. Again, the last statement date, the charge-off date, the last payment date, the transaction date, or the judgment date. So we got to make sure that the charges that the debt collector is trying to collect on goes back to one of those dates. Of course, that information can come from the original creditor. So if the original creditor and that debt collector are not on the same page, there could be some issues there, and that could open them up. That could open up the debt collector to some liability right there. So that's all on the horizon. These proposed changes are on the books for November 20th of 2021. So this year, this is when all the proposed rules, including this rule, is scheduled to be in effect and active. So until then, everything should be business as usual. But at that point, there's going to be some strict guidelines that these debt collectors are going to have to follow. So that's my time today on this video. Let me know what you think in the comment section, or if you have any questions. Also, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And any questions you have regarding this, or just any questions in general, drop them in the comment section. Last but not least, if you are looking to learn more about credit repair, credit scoring, credit building, etc., or you need help with your own personal credit, then I have a link in my bio. Basically, if you go to my website, joechavarria.com/links, joechavarria.com is basically my personal page. Lots of articles that I've written, lots of videos I put together, a little compressed center to where you can get a lot of data, a lot of credit information. But if you want to take action on your credit, go to joechavarria.com/links. You can get access to a recommended credit monitoring service where you can monitor your credit through all 3 credit bureaus for just $1 to get that going. You can schedule a complimentary credit review by myself or one of my team members at my office that can review your credit report a little bit more in detail, break things down for you, talk about what you can do to boost credit, what we would do for you, how we would go about it. And if you wanted to hire one of our team members or whatever you want to hire our company, then we'll provide you with a free, quote on what it would cost to do that. So you make a decision whether or not you want to outsource the credit repair work to us, or you at least have enough information to where if you want to do it yourself and you got the time, you can go ahead and do that. So go to joechavarria.com/links to learn more. Other than that, I want to thank you guys for tuning in. It's been another exciting episode of the Joe Credit Show. I'll see you on the next one. Take care, guys.